for everyone today. And for folks not here, I'd love to get this in front of them. Uh,
It's recording.
cool. Well, for those I haven't met, Andy Olive out in California, with Fresh Approach. I'm a little sick today, so hopefully my words, will go in the right order. Um, but my presentation here today is about anticipating upcoming advocacy for the LFPA continuation marker bills. I can't remember their name variations. But we want to help our national advocate partners, FSLN and NSAC specifically, anticipate some of their advocacy work in the coming months, specifically helping them to raise farmer voices to specific congressional representatives. So essentially, getting the farmers who are LFPA impacted to vocalize their support for the upcoming bills. We want to organize as much information nationally as we can ahead of time so our national advocates can move quickly and pressure and provide impact data in a targeted way. So I believe in the past, Samiha and Acacia, who built this tool, presented on it. I'll quickly go over it, but this is really a call in to begin collecting information about the farms impacted, and most specifically, not like data impacts, but really who's connected to these farms. How can we build a directory of navigation so that if Hannah at NSAC or anyone else comes calling looking for a farm advocate in a specific region, we can figure out who's connected to that farm and get them on the line very quickly so that they can get into an office meeting with a congressional leader. So this is actually also, I think, Wallace, or sorry, FSLN, did great work at running reports to collectivize impact, but this is also a starting point for potentially in the future nationalizing and creating a database of LFPA impact. So by emoji hands, I'm just curious how many people here are LFPA recipients or participants in one way or another. Seeing some thumbs up, hands. Wonderful. So this, what I'm going to be presenting to you all is a form to start collecting information, and I'll share how it works and what we think the information is going to use. So this is largely going to be directed to LFPA participants. However, we realize there's a lot of folks here. There's a lot of people who aren't here that are part of LFPA, and you might be in a state where you're not an LFPA recipient or participant, but you know who is. So the form we'll be sharing is also meant to capture that information to help us get to the people we're trying to talk to. So first, I'm going to share the tool that shout outs to our team here, Samiha and Acacia, for building. And it's what we used back in February to get our farms on the line. I'm going to share it. Um, what we're or sorry, where the information will live or what it will look like rather, to really stress the point that we're not collecting farm names in this, we're collecting who's connected to farms. We don't want to create a repository that could be, used for various reasons outside of our control to contact any farms at all. um, so let me share a screen real quick. So it's very straightforward. We created a spreadsheet that documents every district by party affiliation, also whether they're ag committee, which is really helpful information. And then a very simple column of number of farms that have been supported in that district by LFPA. And then very simply, who can get a hold of those farms. So, we're looking at, Doug LaMalfa. We know that the USDA is responding to Republicans. We know that ag committee members are even more important. We know that LaMalfa in California had 37 farms supported in his district by the program. Can we call those farms who are supported? Can they call LaMalfa? Can he call the USDA? It's a bit of a reach, but every farm voice counts, especially if you can collectivize. In our version of this template, we went further and documented dollar impact. We're not going to collect this here because we don't, again, we want to, respect data privacy as well as just, it's not exactly necessary. You all can figure that out if you get into the meetings with congressional leaders. Um, and then secondly, we've also created a tab that from our form, we want to collect information really about the organizations that are subcontract to lead regional and statewide administration of the program. Finding out who these organizations is really important because they're the ones who hold the most impact data and farm data. So, for example, in California, ourselves, CAF, Community Alliance of Family Farms, and the California Association of Food Banks, we administer the largest portion of the project, and we hold collectively the data. So we in ourselves can find the information around 800 farms. So learning and just having in one place who all those people are is really helpful for this group here, as well as really for our national advocates who can more quickly get to the people who have the most information. Um, and that's essentially how it will work. We've created rows for every district in the country. We're going to collect information from you, and I'll go over how we're going to collect it. And then we will transcribe it. Our team will transcribe it into this format. There's going to be questions at the end of the form that I show you about everyone's comfort levels. I don't want to assume that people want to share this level of data or who they want to share it to. So we haven't exactly determined what the privacy settings will be on this information. I'm going to promote that if you're filling it out, you at least are comfortable sharing this level of information, and it's basically just your organization name, no farm name, with the NSAC team who's advocating, as well as anyone here in FSLN. And what we can do, of course, this is done in Google. We can make this a restricted invite only sheet where you have to submit a request. Also, at a minimum, if you're filling out for Alabama, uh, we can just email back your own information in this format so you can collectivize your impact by district. I guess I guess I'll quickly stop for questions before I go over how we're gonna collect this.
Buck's got a great question in the chat about tribes or tribal organizations being able to be a part of this process.
Yeah, so absolutely. Tribes are in there. Tribes are also in states with farms and districts. So in our collection form, there's a place to indicate tribe, but as well as to indicate which district those farms are in. So essentially, tribes can absolutely be advocates. They can be the ones who know the farms and the districts, and those farms are still voices that, in a normal world are cared for by their congressional leaders. But we do clarify in the form, and you'll see this for tribes to identify what states they're in.
And Andy, correct me if I'm wrong, but I just want to clarify also that we're partnering with NSAC on this to push forward some of the advocacy efforts. So we're hoping to collect a lot of this information, but we'll not be the only group doing the advocating.
Yeah, absolutely. Like we can one, we think this will be helpful for you and your states to advocate, and this is how we use it. It's also for the national organizations who are working in DC, less really, especially NSAC. But then, of course, all of you in your states and through your networks. Any other questions?
Michaela, I see you have your hand up, but I wonder if that's from earlier indicating about involvement with LFPA or if you have a question. That might have been from earlier.
Great.
Any other questions? Yeah, but
So I guess I'll take maybe just like a step further. So could we share this information with like our technical assistance people? I'm speaking for myself personally and tribes, like with the Native Farm Bill Coalition or like Indigenous Food and Agricultural Initiative that does maybe an Intertribal Agricultural Council to make to get it more I guess, open or make tribes more aware of this, that they could be involved in this process?
Yeah, so I asked, there's a section here asking about data sharing and what people are comfortable with. What we'll do is clean up the data and make it simple to know which districts your farm connections or farms are connected to, and you absolutely can use that data however you want. We'll just make it a little bit more organized for you. Then collectively, there's a section to ask questions about how we as a group and it's really those filling out their data feel comfortable sharing with it. I personally think it can be shared pretty far and wide because no farms are being listed. It's really the groups whose names are being listed, who are connected to farms that are being reached out to, could be reached out to. So I personally think it's pretty safe information. But again, I don't want to assume that. So there is a section here to understand what the people filling out the data feel comfortable with. And probably at the next FSLN, I'll ask to come back and come to agreements about how it will be shared. But again, at a minimum, our ask is that if you're filling this out, you're comfortable with it being shared with NSAC, who really have their, finger on the pulse of the advocacy necessary.
Mhm.
Um, okay, so I'm going to put in the chat a link to the form. We're going to use Google Form, um, and I'll walk through it on my screen, but I'm also going to put it in the chat um, if you want to look at it that way. So one thing to note, well, we'll get there later. It's hard to put things in the right order when you're feeling a little under the weather. Um, Let me see, where am I? Okay, so we're doing it as a Google form. There's an overview of basically what I just said at the top. And it's really straightforward. Well, I don't know how long it'll take you. Um, Again, this information is the data we're trying to collect is really going to come from people in this room who know the farms who are supported by LFPA. So if you're an individual farm, that's great. Your data will just be one row of information about yourself. If you're a food hub, even better, you're probably connected to, however many dozens of farms supported by LFPA. If you're a regional or statewide administrator, like ourselves, we have hundreds of farms we can connect to. But again, if you're not an LFPA participant but know what's going on in your state, and know that the people who are running LFP in your state aren't in this room, filling this out is also helpful for us so we can go do targeted outreach to them and have them fill it out. So this is clear just for everyone, not just for LFPA participants, but also LFPA knowledge holders. So pretty straightforward stuff. Name, email, states, as you can see for tribes, please just choose your state. Um, and then here's a drop down list of what's your LFPA affiliation. Here's a question, so going forward, the data at a minimum that we need for this to work, and this is a really test case, which maybe long term can be a way to actually expand our collective impact reporting as a group. But at a minimum, what we need this to work is farm zip code. That's how we run our formulas to find the districts. We know for LFPA reporting purposes, every state is required to. Uh, Actually, I'm like pretty sure this is true. Um, we're feel I think every state is required to record zip code of farm. So where we'll get to in collecting, you'll see that that's basically the bulk of the information we need. If you click no, there's a section for just how to learn about the LFPA in your state, and that's where the form will end for you. Basically, can you help us explain what LFPA looks like in your state? Who's responsible for administering? And if you're comfortable, can you make the connection to that state for us to follow up with? But for those who do have LFPA information, we're trying to learn a little bit more about you. Again, learning about your LFPA in summary. Are you the organization who can share data? If not your organization, sort of similar to above, who is? Um, and website for your program. But here's where the bulk of the data is. And the only way to really do it was that we could figure out is an Excel upload or a Google Sheet upload. Um, and so let me show you what with a really simplified data set. Um, and this is what it looks like. Can people still see my screen? Do you see a spreadsheet now? Okay. So again, everything here is just to figure out who's connected to who. So it's just your organization name. If you're filling this out, you'll probably just scroll it down like that. Um, if and then instead of a farm name, you'll just want to write farm one, farm two, and scroll it down. And in that, we just need that to differentiate to make sure that every line is differentiated, that the farm in row two is not the farm in row three. um, then the zip code of that farm. And again, that's the key piece of information we need to know. And it will take some effort on y'all's parts to figure this out, especially if you're dealing with hundreds of farms. But we're hopeful that this is basic information you all have stored somewhere, and can pull relatively quickly. And then lastly, can you reach this farm via phone or email? Like, does your or is your organization able to get a hold of this farm, or can you get a hold of the group that can get a hold of them? Because if you can't, it's not necessarily the information that we'll be capturing because, if we can't get to that farm, we can't really use them for advocacy. Um, or I guess I can add or know someone who can. And then that's it. So we're asking you to fill it out to the number of farms that you know that are LFPA impacted. And then I'll also say it could be a food hub, but food hubs represent multiple farms. And again, we think the USDA is most responsive to farm voices. Samiha, I see your hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to, Andy, if you could reiterate, we have a couple questions in the chat about who should be filling this out. Just questions around like if they're one of the folks that have purchased the produce just for one farm. So if you can maybe reiterate and explain who should be filling out the information.
That's a great question, and one we sort of anticipated and weren't the best at figuring out how to answer. Basically, if you know a farm that has been supported by LFPA at all, whether you purchase, like whether federal dollars reached a farm, whether it's one, five, 10, 200, this spreadsheet is for you to fill out. Um,
Yeah, and I wonder,
Even
Andy,
if it's one row. Is that simple?
I think also if there's multiple groups that facilitate, like if there's multiple individual farms in this call right now for I think the state of Illinois, it would probably be best if one organization filled out all of the information for all those farms.
Yes, that's true. I will say it's okay if it's duplicative, because the way we can capture it is that two organizations know these farms. Um, but yes, I will say the most like uh, efficient and scalable way to collect this information is really to push statewide administrators of LFPA who are holding collective impact data to be the ones to fill it out. We did make this, knowing that this group here is pretty diverse in their LFPA participation, from individual farms to food hubs, et cetera. We made it broad so a lot of people could fill it out. But I will say the most effective, yeah, groups to fill it out are the statewide or regional operators who are holding wide collective impact information. Um, so lastly, I can't remember. Yeah, so to fill this out, you have to click the link to the template, download it as an Excel file. So please don't, I think you can only, when you click this, you can only view that spreadsheet. You need to download it as an Excel file, and upload it here. To do that, you need to have a Gmail account. If you don't have a Gmail account, that's totally fine. Please just download this and make the Excel file and email it to me directly, and that works as well. So, and then lastly, we have some data privacy questions, basically comfort level sharing with NSAC, extra feedback. Um, and that's pretty much it. This is a real, I think, first test of whether we can collect information this way. We hope it works. We know it was really effective here in California. We hope it can be both effective in your states. Um, and but also really nationally. So hopefully this works.
Let's try it. Thank you,
Uh,
Andy and Samiha and the whole Fresh Approach team for creating something, like making an attempt at aggregating this information in some way, and know that it has been really challenging from the national perspective. And I know Hannah, if she was here, she would be able to speak to this of just being able to pinpoint specific people that can advocate for the program in specific districts. So what we're trying to do is essentially make a sophisticated phone tree, to be able to like aggregate that information and get in touch with people quickly. So let's try it. Thanks for offering this, Andy, Samiha, and others, Acacia and others at Fresh Approach. In the
yeah.
interest of time, I'm going to move us along. Do you
Sorry, I'll
have
just say
one last thing?
I put the link into the chat. We can write this up as an email. I don't know, Susan, if Andrew, if you can like cut our video to just this part and we can include that this instruction space for people to fill it out. In the link I just sent, yeah, like Buck, you can uh I think access this and just download the file itself and email that to me directly, for folks who don't have Gmail. So and then, like I said, probably, hopefully next month we'll come back, share the results, and share what we think the best sharing structure will be.
Awesome.
And I'll put my
Thanks,
email in the
y'all.
chat.
And Andy, I think there might be a couple other questions in the chat, so maybe you can answer those
Okay, I can answer in the
in
chat.
the chat. Great. Well, thank you. Let's all just like give them some love and appreciation for taking up that leadership to make that happen. I know that Hannah Quigley from National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition wanted to be here to give some policy updates, but the whole NSAC team is at a retreat today, as a staff. So we can send them some love. I know that they're plotting and scheming and planning on how to support us and our community in continued advocacy, for our priorities in DC. But Hannah did share a couple of resources for me to give to y'all. One is a blog that the NSAC team put together about the shutdown. So this is a really helpful, just kind of overview of what's happening and how the shutdown is impacting farmers. So if you haven't seen that, take a look at that resource that I just dropped in the chat. And then also, the National Young Farmers Coalition is inviting folks to share how farmers are being impacted by the shutdown. They've got a survey that they've been trying to get out into all of our communities. So take a look at that. If you have farmers in your networks that you're in partnership with that are being impacted right now from freezes related to the shutdown or lack of service through Farm Service Agency and other agencies of USDA, please take a look at that and encourage them to fill out that survey. Okay, lots going on that front. Okay, so let's shift gears. Thank you again, Andy and Samiha and Acacia for sharing all that. And I'm really excited to hand over the mic to Karina Lundahl and Julia Van Soelen Kim from UC Cooperative Extension in Northern California. These two wonderful people have been spearheading the North Coast Emergency Food System Partnership, which is a USDA funded, Regional Food Systems Partnership funded grant and project that has bringing together stakeholders across the local and regional food system and emergency food system kind of sectors to work together to develop responsiveness in the wake of disasters in communities and really being able to link farmers into emergency feeding opportunities in the wake of disasters. So I'm going to pass the mic over to y'all for a presentation, and then we'll have some discussion after they share what they've been up to. So y'all two, take it away.
Thank you, Susan. Yes, I'm Karina Lundahl, and Julia is here sharing slides and will be jumping in a bit. And I also saw that one of our community partners, Aya Mahan, is also on the call. So welcome, Aya. Glad to have you in as well. So today we're going to be talking about the California North Coast Emergency Food System Partnership with you all, and really excited to be here. Thank you, Susan, for inviting us. Thank you for having us. Great to be in the room with you all. We're hoping to talk about some of the connections between day-to-day emergency feeding through programs like LFPA and disaster feeding, so how people are fed, as Susan was saying, in the wake of fire, flood, earthquake. So talking about how those systems are connected and also some of the distinctions. We are primarily in this project focusing in on disaster feeding and preparing for disasters. But as we'll talk about, there's a lot of connection between the day-to-day and what happens during disaster. So I'll go a little bit into kind of the overview of our project and the conceptual framework. We'll talk about some of the challenges and opportunities that we're encountering, and then we'll also share some emerging learnings with you all, and then we'll have an opportunity for discussion at the end. Next slide, please. Thank you. Oh, last slide. So this is just the introductory slide to our project. We are with the University of California's Agriculture and Natural Resources Department with Cooperative Extension. And the blue counties highlighted here are the counties that this project is operating in. So all throughout the North Coast, just in Marin, just north of the Bay of San Francisco in the Bay Area, up to the Oregon border in Del Norte. There's 6 counties that are inclusive to this project. And we have community partners in the far north, up in Del Norte, bordering Oregon, and in Humboldt, just below that. And we have a partner in Sonoma. And we have collaborators throughout the 6 counties, though. And really, what this project aims to do is to bring together people involved in emergency management and disaster response and food system actors and create connection and learnings throughout the community so that we can prepare better to feed people in the event of disaster in our communities. The project is funded by the USDA's Regional Food System Partnerships grant program and started in the fall of 2022 and is currently will be funded through September of next year. So we're in our final year. Next slide. The primary objectives of the grant are to connect local food into emergency and disaster food assistance, again, with a strong focus on disaster food assistance. We do that we're trying to meet that objective through building a community of practice across the 6 counties And in that community of practice, we're really focused on both building kind of informal relationships and formalized relationships in the form of emergency feeding plans that are incorporated into disaster response plans at the county level. And through that community of practice and that work, we are identifying and recommendations. Next slide. So the framework we're working within is within the concept of resilience and food systems resilience. I'll just read this aloud. Food systems resilience is the capacity over time of a food system and its units at multiple levels to provide sufficient, appropriate, and accessible food to all in the face of various and even unforeseen disturbances. So the focus here really being on what's bolded. We are aiming to provide both quality and quantity of food to vulnerable communities, even in the face of extreme disturbances like earthquake and fire. I believe that's important, and that's the focus of this work. Next slide. And I think here, this illustrates that with a little more specificity. Understanding that disasters and where this work came out of, which maybe I wasn't around in this project when the work was being conceived and proposed, but I know a lot of it came out of the 2017 wildfires in this region. And the understanding that in the event of disaster, both the weaknesses, the vulnerabilities, and the strengths of our food systems are sort of highlighted, magnified, brought to the forefront. And with seeing disasters as an opportunity for intervention that could either, address weaknesses and lean into strengths in the food system or cause greater negative impacts to the food system. So disasters really being an opportunity to step in, lean in, and support our food systems to be on a better path. Next slide. And so that is the connection we see partly through the day-to-day feeding and a disaster feeding. They're connected in many ways in the sense that I think we can sort of conceptually understand that if we have a very strong, resilient, connected food system day to day and are addressing chronic food needs, that the community will be more resilient in times of crisis. But some distinctions to make in terms of feeding, the types of feeding that happens, as opposed to the types of food that is distributed day to day and day-to-day feeding through food banks such as groceries and food boxes. Crisis feeding, disaster feeding is really often in the form of prepared meals. So that's an important distinction here. Next slide. And so this graphic we've borrowed and enhanced from emergency management, and sort of to highlight that if this y-axis line here is a disaster event, that there are 3 distinct feeding phases in disaster management sort of lingo and planning. You have the immediate phase, which is the first 3 days, 48 to 72 hours directly after an event, where often damage is being assessed, community impacts are being assessed, and in terms of feeding to affected communities, things aren't necessarily online yet in terms of outside intervention and support. And so both during the immediate and sustained feeding phase, I think it's important to call out here that this is sort of the prepared meal phase, which is in the first 2 weeks after a disaster. Often people might not have access to infrastructure to their homes, and they're really needing food that is in a form that they can consume without the help of a kitchen. And then the long term is that day to day, communities are often affected much longer after 2 weeks. And then this is where a lot of our food banks and other programs that might come into play, such as DSNAP, come in to support communities. Next click, Julia. So just to show, so this line is just showing what disaster feeding resources could have when they come into a community. And particularly, this curve might represent folks like the Salvation Army and Red Cross and county connections stepping in, maybe entering into those shelters, setting up mobile feeding units and field kitchen operations to provide those prepared meals to folks. Next click. And what we've found through conversation with these organizations and in our community of practice is that we're really starting to identify an opportunity to connect more local food in these areas where those folks are not yet in the community. Those first 48 to 72 hours are often a time of great need, but not a lot of need is yet being addressed, and it's a crucial time for local food to step in. It's an opportunity for local food to step in and feed the community. And there's in the long term, past 2 weeks, say after the Salvation Army has left the immediate community, there's a big opportunity there too for local food to play a part. And something we're exploring, and I think Julia will talk about a bit more later on, is that through this community practice, we've started to build relationships with our entities that do come in. So state agencies and the Red Cross and Salvation Army, and seeing an opportunity for partnership with local food businesses and local food during that sustained feeding phase during the 2 weeks there in the community. Next slide. So some of the examples of local that we have been highlighting or discovering and highlighting in our community of practice and in this project are represented here. It kind of runs the gamut. So in terms of local producers and local food businesses, we see there's a company called Buckhorn Meat Company that's slightly outside of our immediate region, but we've started to engage with them as a model of how an individual operation can engage with these folks that come in during disasters. So they have a formalized relationship with our California Department of Social Services Disaster Services Branch, and they're kind of they have set up an important regional community of practice of sorts for feeding entities that come together. And so they're an important connecting point. And Buckhorn Meat has an MOU with them that says, yes, we're available. This is how much product we can provide in the event of a disaster. So day to day, they're a local family-owned restaurant chain that also has a meat processing facility, and they have product that they can provide to people like the Salvation Army or other agencies coming in to feed during a disaster. Other more local examples we have in the community is in Sonoma County. We have Ceres Community Project. These folks are amazing. They're a nonprofit that provide local, organic, medically tailored meals to the community on a day-to-day basis, but they're building up their own organizational infrastructure to be resilient during disasters. So they have increasing off-grid cold storage capacity to store their meals, and they have a contract with Sonoma County that in the event of a disaster, they can step into shelters directly and provide meals to folks in need. Another Sonoma organization that is an example of local in disaster feeding is a nonprofit called the Sonoma Family Meal. And day to day, they are a nonprofit culinary training program with a teaching kitchen. And in disasters, they have an incredible network of restaurants that they network with to provide food to evacuees and first responders. And if you have questions, we can talk more about them later. They're really interesting in that they came out of the 2017 wildfires. So they first were an organization that came into fruition in response to community need during disaster, and then came up with their sort of day-to-day model after. And so at the heart of who they are and what they've come out of is disaster response. Also, a broader Bay Area organization that is really interesting is Off the Grid. They day to day provide mobile food markets and cultural events throughout the Bay Area. but they have also developed a really interesting platform called the Food Responder Platform that is designed specifically for disaster feeding. So they have truck infrastructure they can deploy, but they also have a really interesting app platform for capturing all the information that's needed to coordinate with government agencies to receive reimbursement to local restaurants or food providers during disaster. So they're super interesting and a really great model for how you can connect local food businesses into disaster feeding. Next slide. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Julia, who is the director of this project, to share more about our emergency findings and how we're understanding local in the context of disaster feeding.
Thank you so much, Karina. And again, I'm Julia. I'm with UC Cooperative Extension. And day to day, I'm a food systems advisor. So my work really focuses on how we build and develop a thriving local and regional food system on the California North Bay and North Coast. And that work led me to helping co-develop this project with partners across the North Coast to really unite our shared experiences in disasters and really be able to learn from each other about how we can use disasters as this magnifying glass to understand how our local food system can thrive and function day to day and be more resilient in the face of all of these many multi-layered disasters that the North Coast of California has experienced over time. So when we first developed this idea, we wrote our grant before LFPA was in existence. And so we were really imagining doing both LFPA kind of work around engaging local farmers to get their product into food banks, as well as sort of this disaster response work in what we call gray skies times. And in the course of the grant, as LFPA became more prominent in our region, and as we understood the unique context that disasters provide, both the pressures and the opportunities, we've broadened our understanding of what our project is looking at and sort of the assets that our local food system can bring to bear in this topic. So we've really moved from an idea of farm to emergency food assistance, in which we're focused on fresh produce, typically provided as household groceries, sort of pantry staples through a food bank or food pantry, that sort of requires the local food system and local farmers and ranchers, fishers, to be providing reliable and steady supply over time, and also requires a really robust distribution infrastructure, like healthy, well-developed food hubs that are well networked with their farmers and with their food buyers, and necessitate some kind of transactional relationship, like sellers being ready, farmers being ready to sell, buyers, in this case, emergency food providers being ready to buy, and funding to be able to make that transaction happen. And that if all that lines up, then in the event of a disaster, nurturing this kind of sales relationship can provide alternate or supplemental sales to local producers when their primary markets dry up because of a disaster. So for example, if their primary markets close because there's wildfires and an evacuation area, or to smoky skies, bad air quality events that are making all the restaurants and tourism scale back, then having these connections with emergency food buyers provides farmers with this alternate source of income. And what we realized through the course of this work is that those are really lofty goals, but there's other ways that our local food system can be engaged in addition to those sort of sales pathways between farmers and emergency food buyers. And that there are a lot of sort of intermediary steps that need to take place and be built up before that original goal can really be achieved in a robust way. And so we've brought in our understanding of how we're conceptualizing this work to really think about local food resources in disasters. And as Karina mentioned, one of the reasons is because we're usually not needing fresh produce, we're needing prepared meals in a disaster. And that's because typically people are congregating in a shelter or in an evacuation area, and they need hot meals. So the focus on prepared meals has really shifted sort of like the relevance of direct agricultural products versus needing this sort of intermediary to prepare meals. And that intermediary can source locally as well. But a whole bunch of kale doesn't do us much good when we have an evacuation shelter and a lot of mouths to feed who need a hot meal. And we've also really increased our understanding of the urgency or the immediate need to have these meals available in the first 72 hours after a disaster, as Karina was explaining with that time sequence diagram. And so this requires different kinds of local food distribution infrastructure. It relies more heavily on commercial kitchens, on skilled labor, and on volunteers and staff who have food safety training. And it also requires a more complex web of collaborative relationships. If we think about just farm to emergency food assistance, that absolutely rests on collaborative relationships between farmers and food hubs and buyers. But this requires an added layer of collaborative relationships between government, large regional feeding entities like the Salvation Army or like World Central Kitchen, and then local community-based organizations who are deeply rooted in communities with understanding of their local geography, the areas of their communities that are most susceptible to disasters, as well as their local population and demographics that make certain community members more vulnerable to disasters. And then lastly, leaning into looking at local food resources in disaster allows an opportunity for a broader range of local actors and local assets to be leveraged or brought to bear in a disaster. From the community-based organizations that might be medically tailored meal providers or school food providers, school meal providers, to locally owned food businesses, whether that's food trucks, like the example off the grid that Karina spoke to, or restaurants, like the example of Buckhorn Catering or Buckhorn Meats Company, to locally owned grocery stores. And then all of those relationships of prepared food providers can have additional linkages strategically with local agricultural producers and the local ag supply chain so that they can source product locally in the event of a disaster. I'll also say that this allows us to have more pieces of the puzzle linked together in advance of a disaster. And so there can be greater interaction between scales of disaster response. So for example, local community-based organizations might not be preparing meals, but they might be providing the kitchen infrastructure for an outside agency, or they might be providing the trucking and distribution infrastructure or the volunteer workforce for other food providers coming into an area during a disaster at that sort of peak of the resource curve that Karina showed. And so through this work, if we think of findings, that sort of shifting definition of local, what we mean by local is sort of like first finding that we'd like to share. And the second finding is the real central importance of relationships. And I know we're all in the local food movement, and so I don't think that comes as a surprise. Sort of the variety and scale of these relationships is what we're increasing our understanding of. So the first is self-evident. It requires supply chain relationships between producers and food distributors and food hubs and those buyers. and it requires a robust local food supply chain. But we're also increasingly understanding the crucial role of cross-sector relationships between emergency managers and local food systems advocates and county government and tribal government and regional and national feeding entities. And so those cross-sector relationships have been especially important in this working in this space. And then cross-jurisdictional relationships or cross-scale relationships from unincorporated rural areas to municipalities, their local county government, and then state government. And so those cross-jurisdictional relationships are really central. And one of the reasons why relationships have really been at the center of this work and the need to build and strengthen these robust networks of relationships is because in a disaster, the urgency of making decisions is so crucial to understand. People are making decisions under time pressure, often with communication platforms that are down. And so they rely on who they already know to make decisions quickly, and can only make decisions based on who's already in their network and where those memorandum of understanding are already documenting a specific kind of feeding relationship. So we've learned how important it is to build these relationships across these different scales, geographies, and sectors ahead of disasters, so that decisions can be made differently in the moment of a disaster. And we've also found that across the board, these different stakeholders are really committed to and eager to making these new relationships because of the frequency, the duration, and the scale of disasters that we're having on the North Coast. And really a shift from sort of like a territory grab of like, we want to be able to be the first to be called in to respond, to a realization that there's enough space at the table for everyone and that it takes everyone to respond appropriately to these large, unprecedented, and sustained disasters. And so regional feeding entities and local and state government, we're finding, really want first, second, and third bench options around feeding partners. And they're really interested in local partners who can get deep into rural communities quickly in that first 72 hours, as well as larger feeding partners that can help resource even across regions in a disaster, work outside of their immediate region to service another region and give mutual aid. And then lastly, in regards to relationships, I'll say that relationships are especially important in our rural areas. So on our more geographically isolated North Coast in California, that has long rural roads that are very vulnerable to earthquakes, mudslides, floods, you name it. And so because rural areas are often isolated from the broader food supply chain and broader environment of external resourcing coming in, they really need to lean into their own internal relationships within their community. And what we've been hearing is really this idea that no one's coming, and so we need to be ready to take care of ourselves. And so one of the main ways that this project has built relationships across sectors and scale and geography is by creating a community of practice of our own on the California North Coast. And Karina spoke to this a little bit. In essence, our community of practice for this project is seeking to facilitate these cross-sector relationships to increase our shared and our collective knowledge of food systems, local food systems, and disaster response, and to build our collective capacity to effectively coordinate disaster feeding in the face of disturbances. So our network is growing every time we meet. New people come to the table. It's now over 300 people with 150 organizations represented. Together, we're developing emergency feeding plans that help codify the relationships that we're building and define the roles and responsibilities that each entity has in a disaster. And we're starting to inventory local emergency food supply chain resources and assets that can be brought to bear in a disaster. So the last finding that I'd like to share is around the barriers and opportunities that are emerging. And we really wanted to lift up where there were policy implications in this work. So the first barrier that we've really has become so clear is that there is no clear and consistent funding mechanism or policy pathway for paying for local food in emergencies. So there isn't the equivalent of LFPA for gray skies for disaster times. And furthermore, at the federal and state level, there are specific policy barriers that make this work hard. At the FEMA level, there's no local preference and there's a requirement to accept lowest bids. So there's no local or geographic preference and a need to accept just the lowest bidder. And then for rural areas, when a state or federal disaster declaration is declared, that enables money and aid to flow to that area. But for rural areas, it's really hard to reach that threshold because of the low population density and because of the comparably less expensive housing stock in rural areas. And so, at least on the California North Coast, I imagine this is the case for much of the rural United States, is that there may be a very substantial disaster that has really taken out significant infrastructure and housing, but it doesn't meet the dollar threshold of a disaster declaration. And so there's a unique need to really think about how we recognize and support disasters in rural areas that's different from this dollar threshold. For the opportunities, we see lots of really exciting and encouraging opportunities to develop sort of little p solutions like plans, as well as big P solutions like policies, and in particular policies that can fund incorporating local food resources into disaster response. So this looks like opportunities for emergency feeding plans and collaborative relationships, opportunities for policies that are unique to the needs of rural communities and who are both more vulnerable to disasters geographically as well as demographically and economically. And then lastly, to really lean into opportunities for state, local, federal government, and the philanthropic sector to financially support this work with the goal towards greater community resilience. So by really resourcing local procurement and local feeding resources, leaning into local feeding resources in disasters, it helps bring money, federal money, philanthropic money back into a community when the community needs it most. So that's just a glimpse of our emerging findings. And we had some questions of our own because we're very much learning as we're doing this work. So I wanted to hand it over to Karina for our discussion questions with all of you.
Thank you, Julia. And I'm going to check in with you, Susan. I know we're pretty far over time. How much time do you think we have here for discussion?
Yeah, we're good. I mean, we had till 2:30 Central, 3:30 Eastern. So let's just, let's roll and see how far we can get.
All right.
Yep.
And folks have had a lot of input and questions in the chat too. So maybe we can throw out a discussion prompt and then also just open it up to discussion for folks to jump in and share verbally what you might be curious about that you didn't have addressed yet. So I definitely read some examples from our colleagues here in California, some of which I think I knew about, but some examples of incorporating local food into disaster feeding in local communities. Does anyone else here want to share any experiences that they've had with incorporating local food in disaster feeding? If so, please feel free to unmute yourself and share an experience. We'd love to hear about it.
I can talk about the fire one I mentioned.
Hmm.
As you've, called out, like for certain things, uh, meals are just way more necessary, and it's a harder avenue for local farms to participate in. So this one had to have a pretty complicated partnership of support where we had funding from a funder who cared about local. We had a partnership in place through Off the Grid, as you mentioned, who was partnered with Google Kitchens. So we had to have sort of three efforts ourselves for local procurement, a kitchen that could do meal prep, and this was during COVID as well. So those kitchens were already activated to do emergency meal prep, so Google Kitchens, and then last mile distribution through Off the Grid. So that one was much more complicated in partnerships. We did a similar program for floods, which was more about floods also require, I think, natural disasters require more like emergent meals. For that one, the model was more about preserving the food from farms rather than getting meals to flood impacted families out of their homes. So that one was a bit easier because the partnership flow was really just pre-existing CSA box models. And it between those two, they sort of had different, yeah. The first one was more comprehensive and a circular support for farms and families. The second, of course, helps families as well, but was built around getting that food out of the ground quickly.
And do you know if that was the same example, do you know that I am aware of? Do you know if that happened in Sonoma County as a result of anticipated floods and used LFPA funding?
Yeah, so the Sonoma County one, we used LFPA funding, pre-existing funding, and administrative processes and partnerships. So we were able to just quickly use pre-existing systems and funding.
Sorry, was it similar for the fire example that
The
we're
fire
talking about?
one,
Yeah, what was the funding source to support that work? Do you
so
know?
that was a private funder that we already had pre-existing relationship with, and we put in an emergency ask. So that is a good point. Something we were talking to with CAF in California was having a pot of emergency fund that could be flexible to this need because you need the funding in place as well, or the ability to get it really quickly. Um, so that was a pre-existing funder that we did an emergency ask of.
Yeah. Thank you. We recently started speaking with a community foundation that has some pre-existing funding set up that has to be activated during disaster as well up in Humboldt. So it's an interesting, just some of these funding models are really important to understand and just figure out where it's replicable in other communities. Did
Some
anybody else? Go
Oh,
ahead.
sorry,
Yeah,
I'll just say, so one other thing, sorry to take up extra space today. Uh,
Peter.
but this might be happening in other states, but in California, the state recognized that there needs to be funds for farmers after climate. So there has been earmarked funding to like make farmers right for crop loss. We want to like make the case that you should actually portion a flexible pot to work right in the moment, especially with floods, which are you can anticipate with the forecasting has gotten really well or good.
Mhm.
So so we want to push our state to expand their interpretation of like disaster relief funds for farmers to actually have this resiliency fund for emergency distribution. It's on my long list of to-dos.
We might need to connect with you about that, being that we're all here in California. We'd love to talk about that. Indy, did you want to share?
Sure, yes. Thank you for this conversation. It's so alive. We just did a disaster festival. I know that sounds kind of weird, but we tried to make it, try to have some games. We had resilience games and activities and needs and asset mapping. But we also, made it intergenerational so the kids and everybody could participate, not be scared of disasters. But one of the things that I would love to share in this conversation is that something that's been alive as somebody who's an interfaith leader and on the board of the Interfaith Center, um, as well as just getting grants from Interfaith America and other interfaith, national interfaith organizations. They haven't really moved towards disaster preparation, but I've been talking about it in spaces, and a lot of the older folks from like different religious communities are like, "Oh my gosh, yes, like we need this." Even in Ohio, they want me to come out and help them prepare in Oxford, which is a farming community. And I wonder how we can like be better, just all of us as a community of practice, how we can also start to bring in more religious leaders, whether they're the leaders of Christian or Muslim or I'm Sikh, right? Or I come from the Sikh tradition, which is actually all about feeding people during disasters. Actually, we're actually practice that all the time. So even for you guys, anybody in this community, for you to be connected to the local Sikh church would be so valuable because we already have the infrastructure and the means and the volunteers to feed people right away in a disaster. So how can that also be, how can we tune into these different aspects of these religious and spiritual communities that have a lot of people and have wealth and have the means and the collective willpower to execute stuff. So just throwing that in there as well for us to bring in the spiritual communities as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great highlight. And I'm thinking, yeah, I'm thinking of Aya, who's on the call. I see her sending hearts. She's one of our community partners up in Del Norte and is engaged with many aspects of the community. I think in each community that we're working in, that has been a part of the conversation as well. The importance, the prominence of faith-based organizations and the connections that they have and the resources that they have. And it's definitely um, part of the resources we are assessing is how to keep those relationships and conversation in this as well.
I'll
Thank you.
also add that faith communities have a really important role in terms of sheltering and are often like designated formal shelter sites. But if they're not a designated formal shelter site, identified by a municipality or by the county, they're often sheltering people from within their community informally. And so a lot of this work has been thinking about how to ensure that there is food provided in a disaster in a variety of ways, and that formal county designated shelters are not the only way that food needs to be provisioned in a disaster, and that often there are different communities that are housing people, especially I think in the context of undocumented communities and faith communities that are housing their own and also are really in need of food support because any individual family or church or congregation is feeding more mouths than there typically are in blue sky times. So here on the North Coast, North Bay, Sustainable Interfaith Food Collaborative has been one of our partners in the project, and they have a robust network of different faith-based entities across the North Bay.
And just quickly, I wanna hear from Buck, but I also want to say that reminds me, Julia, of the barrier of commercial kitchens and how that's come up in terms of getting real resources and reimbursement to certain organizations if they don't have access to a certified food safe commercial kitchen. That blocks sort of some funding reimbursement from the county and others, which is a barrier that we discuss. I don't know if we know how to address it as of yet, but Buck, I want to hear from you.
Yeah, thanks for this. This is really informative. It's really really helpful. And as I put in the chat, I've been involved in this Region 10, which incorporates Oregon, Washington, and Idaho and Alaska on a tribal cohort for addressing emergencies and how outside organizations work with tribes and during emergencies. And culturally relevant food did come up, along with, we go through a lot of different things, communication styles and how to reach out to the tribes in appropriate ways. But on a local emergency we had here in the Columbia River Gorge when we had a severe fire that shut down freeways and stuff, food was really, kind of had to be done locally because it shut down our freeways and you couldn't get, any trucking or anything to even come in. So the community kind of had to take over, to feed, the volunteers or the firefighters and things like that. But I really like this and would like to connect and share this with both the groups that I'm involved with and maybe parallel on some things or at least sharing some knowledge that I think would be beneficial because we're borders with you on your Northern California, Southern Oregon, so I just really appreciate the time, and it's been really that group that I'm in Regional 10. It is funded by the CDC, and we just got another 2 years of funding to keep addressing some of these issues because we found out too that in the Oregon emergency preparedness sometimes it's the tribes that are taking care of themselves because they're saying like, well, this is FEMA, we're not, we can't go there, and just different jurisdictional issues and maybe even lack of knowing the right, if it is correct or whatever. So, their tribes have had flooding up here in one of the reservations, and the other tribes really stepped up, bringing in things, that the community needed, and kind of the lead from that tribal emergency preparedness that's housed at the Oregon Health Authority. So all this would be great to share, and I'll talk to the leaders in that group to see if you could come present. I mean, I think it's really, really appropriate because sometimes in emergencies, food isn't thought of, and it's so essential. So thank you.
Absolutely. I don't know, Julia, that just echoes so much of the experiences we've heard, especially from rural and tribal communities in our region. I want to be sensitive. We have about 2 minutes left. So Julia, maybe can you go to the next slide that has our contact information? I put my email in the chat, but also here is Julia and I's contact information. And as Julia said in the chat, Buck, Aya, who's on the call today, is working in Del Norte, right there on the border with Oregon also. But feel free to reach out to me. I'll be happy to connect you with anyone in our project. We'd love to keep connecting with you all, keep hearing from you. And again, just really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. So thank you. There we go. I had just shared her email in the chat as well. Thank you.
Nice. Wow, y'all, thank you so much. You have given us so much to think about and real strategies to utilize. This is really, really high quality information and sharing. So thank you, Julia and Karina, and everybody else that has added into your own experiences, Buck and Andy and Indy and others. Also, really want to appreciate Andy Olive and Samiha and Acacia from Fresh Approach for stepping up and creating a process for us to be able to advocate for local food purchase assistance, like funding more effectively. So thanks to that team. And I know Andy put his information in the chat to get in touch. Lots of sharing and just lots of great thinking happening today. So what an beautiful example of what this community of practice is all about. Thanks everybody for spending 90 minutes of your precious time here together. And Julia and Karina, I really hope that y'all will look for funding when this is over to do some training and support for other communities in what you did here. Y'all are so well suited to do that. And I know there's a lot of interest in this community and all the people who aren't here today that I think would be really, really eager to learn from you. So let us know if we can be supportive in that process in any way. Thanks everybody for being here. We'll see you next month. Our next community practice call is on Thursday, November 20th. And we will have new facilitators because we're just about to bring in a facilitation partner. I know many of you had applied or had heard that we were recruiting for some support for this community practice, and we shall have those folks in place for the next one. So it's been my absolute pleasure to hold this space over the last number of months while we've been in this transition time, and I'm excited to introduce you to the new facilitators soon. So y'all have a great day, and we will talk to you soon. I'll send out the recording and the links and all that stuff in the next week or so. So thank you, Julia, Karina, everybody. Have a good day.